Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into something pretty specific, the core ideas of the MAGA movement. We're looking at what was consistently said between roughly 2015 and 2025.
Yeah, the goal is to kind of pin down these principles now because, well, history shows political movements, they change or get changed.
Right, the original ideas can get lost or even twisted.
Exactly. Think about Orwell's Animal Farm, that final scene where the animals look in and they just can't tell the pigs from the humans anymore.
Oof, yeah, a powerful warning.
It shows how easily movements can end up mirroring the very thing they opposed.
And the sources we looked at, they point to a real-world example closer to home, like the Democratic Party. 40 years ago, they were seen as the party of peace, human rights, anti-corporation. Fast forward past Clinton.
And it became something very different. The sources argue it embraced oligarchy, pushed for wars, even censorship.
So that risk is always there for any group, any party, that they become a kind of mirror image.
Precisely. So that's why we're doing this, trying to lock down what this particular movement actually stood for based on the sources before, things get muddy.
Okay, so the sources identify 5 key themes, pretty consistent over that decade. Let's call them the 5 pillars.
Sounds good. These are presented as the sort of founding principles.
Right, so pillar number 1, America first.
This one's foundational. The idea, basically, is that the U.S. government's main job, its absolute top priority, should always be the interests and security of the American people.
Above everything else.
Above everything else. It's like fulfilling the basic promise of democracy, right? The government works for the citizens who, in theory, own the country.
Now that phrase itself, America first, it got immediate backlash. People brought up Lindbergh in the 30s, called it anti-Semitic.
Oh, absolutely. And the sources see that as a deliberate political tactic designed to shut down discussion of the actual principle, which was this implied realization that maybe, just maybe, a lot of past government decisions weren't made with American interests as the main focus, maybe sometimes not at all.
So the shock wasn't just the phrase, but the underlying idea that governance might have been untethered from national interests.
Exactly. And if that's true, the sources argue, then that kind of governance is illegitimate, anti-democratic even.
This is where that term dual loyalty comes up in the sources, which is obviously a really loaded term. How do they define it here?
They frame it as demanding single loyalty to the U.S. and its citizens. They contrast that with prioritizing, say, international groups or multinational corporations, or, yes, sometimes foreign countries' interests over American interests.
So it's not just about allegiance to another flag, necessarily.
Not necessarily. It's about where the ultimate priority lies. One source puts it bluntly, like, you can only be loyal to one spouse. You can only be truly loyal to one country.
Okay, that's a clear line, which leads directly into pillar number 2, secure borders.
Yeah.
Yep. The basic idea: a nation needs to control who comes in and out. If it can't, it's not really a sovereign country.
And the slogan that captured this was obviously,
build that wall.
right. And the sources argue that the push for secure borders did something else too. It supposedly revealed that parts of the Republican establishment, the leadership, didn't actually want strong borders.
Why not?
Because, the argument goes, they'd become globalists. Their outlook and interests weren't primarily national anymore. They weren't focused solely on their constituents back home.
Okay, and this pillar connects to maybe the most controversial point of the sources, this idea of a great replacement reality. This usually gets dismissed as a conspiracy theory. How do they handle it?
They're very specific. They insist it's not a theory, but a reality measurable through census numbers. Meaning, just looking at the data, the demographic shifts from high levels of immigration are statistically replacing the native-born population share. That's how they define it. Strictly numbers.
And the political angle.
The sources find it highly sinister that both parties seem resistant to even acknowledging this demographic change is happening based on the numbers. They interpret that resistance as meaning that the establishment actually wants this rapid shift.
And the principle behind wanting border control.
That the citizens already living in a country have the basic right, morally and legally, to decide who gets to join their society.
Okay. Sticking strictly to the data interpretation is key there. Let's move to pillar 3. No more pointless wars.
Right. The core argument here is pretty simple. Wars that aren't fought in direct self-defense are bad. They're destructive, they cost a fortune in blood and treasure, they kill your own people.
And often, they end up mostly serving the interests of other countries or specific groups, not the U.S. as a whole.
Exactly. And the sources pinpoint a key moment, that 2016 primary debate. Remember when Trump was the only one on stage who flat out called the Iraq War a disaster?
Yeah, that was shocking at the time. The conventional wisdom was that Republicans, especially veterans, strongly supported those wars.
But the public reaction, the support he got for saying it, showed the opposite. It revealed that actually many people, especially those whose communities were hit hard by casualties or the economic fallout, were deeply against these endless interventions.
The sources also connect these wars directly to problems at home, don't they?
They do. They argue that this string of wars since 2001, none really won, draining resources has weakened the U.S. and directly fueled things like the opioid crisis, especially among veterans and in working-class areas.
So the conclusion is pretty stark.
Yeah, the sources basically say none of these wars were primarily fought for U.S. benefit. They served ideological agendas, foreign policy elites, maybe multinational corporations, but not the average American citizen. Zero net gain for the country, they argue.
Okay. Pillar number 4, real jobs. This is the anti-globalization piece.
Right. The argument is that globalization, while maybe good for a small financial elite bankers, the finance world, by making things easier for capital to move around,
It hollows out the actual country, leaves regular people without decent work, without industries.
exactly. It challenges that whole idea that GDP growth is the only thing that matters. The sources say a country that only relies on finance and, like, real estate speculation, it's eventually going to die.
And they place the blames specifically.
Yes, they make a point of saying it wasn't some abstract force or even just China. It was American companies chasing quarterly profits that actively chose to ship manufacturing overseas
For their own bottom line.
for their own bottom line. And they argue that much of the economic instability we see now is because the real economy, the one that makes things, got stripped bare by finance.
Okay, final pillar, number 5, free speech.
This one they frame as absolutely fundamental, the most basic human right. The difference between being free and being essentially a slave, the ability to speak truthfully, especially to power.
And censorship is the enemy here. How do they define the modern threat?
They look at things like woke culture or certain kinds of sensitivity demands. The sources argue that while these are often presented as ways to protect marginalized groups,
Which sounds good.
right, but in practice, they argue, it often functions as a way to stop less powerful people from criticizing the powerful, an elite protecting itself.
There was a quote in the sources about this. Something about coercion.
Yes, that cancel culture is meant to coerce people into saying what they know to be false and scare them out of saying what they know to be true.
Wow. That's a pretty direct definition of censorship.
It is. The goal, they argue, is force public compliance with things people know aren't true.
Okay, so those are the 5 pillars. America first, secure borders, no more pointless wars, real jobs, free speech. When you lay them out like that, the sources argue they're actually pretty moderate. Traditional American ideas, even.
That's the argument. They seem like common sense principles to many.
So if they're so moderate, why did the Republican establishment seem to fight them tooth and nail? Was it just corruption? Or a deeper ideological split?
The sources suggest it's really both. A mix of, yes, deep corruption tied to special interests, but also a genuine commitment to a different, more globalist ideology.
They hated these pillars because
Because they threaten the whole system that had been built up over decades, benefiting certain donors, lobbyists, and the politicians themselves. Look at borders. The sources point to Ted Cruz, senator of Texas.
Right.
And they say he did, quote, absolutely nothing while millions crossed into his state under Biden. The conclusion drawn is harsh. He must be serving other masters, not Texans, whether that's donors or ideological commitments elsewhere.
And the wars.
The absolute refusal of the Republican establishment to just say, yeah, Iraq was a huge mistake, even after all the death and costs that showed, according to the sources, a profound level of ideological capture, an inability to admit failure.
Even on free speech,
Right.
you wouldn't expect conservatives to be censoring.
But the sources argue that key Republican institutions, think tanks, publications often acted as the enforcers, like scolds trying to keep people in line with the party orthodoxy rather than defending open debate. They mention William F. Buckley in this context historically.
So Trump, by pushing these 5 pillars, basically threw a grenade into that whole Washington consensus.
Pretty much. He exposed or at least challenged how compromised the whole system had become, according to this view.
Which brings us to now, the internal battle for the movement's soul, you could say. The sources highlight a contrast between establishment figures and those seen as consistently sticking to these 5 principles. They name Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massie specifically.
Right. MTG is quoted pointing out how many Republicans just turned their backs on Trump after January 6th. She calls them America last, slaves to big D.C. industries.
And Massie.
He's described as, like, incorruptible, a self-reliant American, fiercely principled, maybe one of the most consistent votes in Congress on these issues.
And they actually got something done together, didn't they? Something rare.
Yeah, the sources highlight this. They apparently teamed up and used their leverage on a debt ceiling vote to force a guaranteed 1% cut to the budget. A real cut, which apparently never ever happens in D.C. budget fight.
That's actual legislative impact based on principles.
But here's the irony the sources point out. People like Ted Cruz or Mark Levin figures who strongly opposed Trump back in 2016 are now supposedly trying to push out people like MTG and Massie.
Why?
Well, follow the money, the sources suggest. Big donors who don't like these 5 pillars, especially the America First foreign policy and anti-war stance, are funding primary challenges against people like Massie. Specifically mentioned is his refusal to take money from foreign lobbies like AIPAC.
Ah. So the threat is that the movement gets co-opted, taken over by the very establishment types it was supposed to replace.
That's exactly the risk highlighted, that it gets stolen, subverted from within.
So it really does circle back to that Animal Farm warning, doesn't it? The core message seems to be these 5 pillars, whether you agree with them or not, represent a set of fairly traditional American ideas. But defending them threatens powerful interests.
And so the fight within the movement today is about stopping it from becoming that corrupted mirror image, preventing the pigs from becoming indistinguishable from the men, so to speak.
It's a battle over consistency and integrity.
Exactly. And speaking of integrity and accountability, the sources connect this whole internal struggle to a much larger, unresolved issue of government accountability. It leads to a really provocative final thought.
Okay. What is it?
The sources argue that if the U.S. is ever going to restore real integrity, it needs a new 9/11 commission.
A new 9/11 commission. Why?
Because, they claim, the evidence of government foreknowledge of the 2001 attacks is just overwhelming. But the original commission was basically a cover-up, a fraud.
Foreknowledge. What evidence do they cite?
Specific things, like the CIA knowing certain hijackers were already in the country and planning something. And maybe even more damning, this unknown investor or group of investors who placed huge bets against the specific airlines and banks that were hit right before the attacks made a fortune.
And the government never revealed who that was.
Never released the name. The sources argue the original commission basically whitewashed everything, its conclusions decided beforehand. So they say, demanding a real investigation, now finding out who knew what, why nothing was done, why no one was truly held accountable, is the ultimate test.
Wow. Connecting the demand for accountability within a political movement today to the demand for accountability for, arguably, the biggest government failure in modern history.
It brings it all back to that core theme, doesn't it? Truth, accountability, and preventing power from protecting itself. That's the firewall against corruption, whether in a movement or a government.
A very powerful thought to end on. Thanks for exploring that with us.
Always interesting to dive deep.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.